Welcome to ETV Presents Head Games, an in-depth look at the concussion crisis in collegiate and professional sports. I'm Bryan Baumgartner. On October 8th, PBS aired the Frontline documentary, League of Denial, the NFL's concussion crisis. The film chronicles the NFL's controversial handling of concussions suffered by former players. On October 23rd, Edinboro University hosted a panel discussion about concussions featuring medical experts and former athletes. We had a chance to sit down with each of the panelists prior to the public event. The panel included former Buffalo Bills safety Mark Kelso, neuropsychologist Dr. Mark Hogue, and former Penn State lineman and Cathedral Prep standout Charles Rush. We begin with George Roberts, former athletic trainer for the Edinboro Fighting Scots, who has also served as an athletic trainer on 2 United States Olympic teams. In his career, Roberts has seen an evolution in the diagnosis and management of sports-related concussions. He feels that the most significant change in the managing of sports-related concussions comes in the education of players and coaches.
I think the biggest advancement we've had in the treatment management of concussions is the educational effort to let people really know what the consequences of repeated concussions can be. And the treatment then, it kind of follows along behind because we're getting more and more patients because of the realization that it can be a devastating thing not to treat concussions in the first place.
Now, when you were an athletic trainer, did you see a repeated problem with concussions in football?
We knew that they were there. I think they were seeing us more than we were seeing them. We were aware that it could be a serious problem. We always had guidelines here at Edinboro with regard to, how we treated concussions, how we treated the athletes, kind of a 3 strikes you're out sort of a thing. But it was the best practice at the time. As I look back on it now, I think, we were so far in the dark ages at that time, but we were doing the thing that was recommended and trying to be prudent, but now it's much more to the forefront.
So at what point did it stop becoming such a 3 strikes and you're out thing and more of a problem that people saw that it was more repetitive?
Yeah, sometime in about the mid-90s, we here at Edinboro started working with the folks at UPMC in Pittsburgh as they were developing their neurocognitive testing. And Edinboro was the second school in the country, I believe, to implement impact testing, which is a product of UPMC Concussion. And impact testing was, we obtained baseline data on all of our athletes from football players to cheerleaders to cross-country runners, whatever sport. We got all of the baseline data on all of our athletes, and then we were able to further test, and we provided data to Impact and helped to do some of their normative studies. So I think it was probably in the mid-90s that we really came to the realization that this was a problem.
Where do we go from here education is obviously important, but what can we do not only here at Edinboro, but also as a nation as a whole to try and move away from this and lessen the risk of concussion in football especially?
Yeah, I think we continue to follow the research, and the research is becoming very, very extensive, and it's tied into not only athletics, but current events in the world. The Department of Defense is leading the way with financial support for research because of the veterans coming back from the war zones. And I think we just continue to follow the research and look at the data and keep updated on what the best practice is, because the best practice just in the last 2 to 3 years has changed dramatically in how we treat these kids. And then as we treat them, the research will tell us if there are any predictive things that we can look at or preventative programs that we can have to help our athletes not suffer the concussions.
Dr. Mark Hogue is a neuropsychologist and part owner of North Shore Psychological Associates. He believes that the cornerstone of better managing sports-related concussions comes in research.
Well, one of the things, Brian, that we know now because of the research that's been done with concussion is that concussion really is a biomechanical change within the brain. As the brain is shaken, there are changes within the calcium and potassium ions within at a cellular level. And so there becomes an energy crisis. Oftentimes, and one of the things that used to sort of fool trainers and coaches and even players themselves is sometimes this biological cascade doesn't really flourish itself for 24 hours. And that's especially true in the younger brain, a little bit more so than the adult brain. And because of some of the research and what's been driven with that, it now helps to drive some of the protocols that we do in both identifying the concussion, but also in the treatment and management of that.
So in your mind, how could the NFL and more youth football developmental leagues further prevent concussions or treat them in a more professional manner?
Wow, that's a big question. You know, there are so many things that can be done. I think that right now, the best practices on what we know that is being driven by the research is good. I think that we certainly are being driven by better research as we go on. We know that science moves with your ability to measure. And one of the things that has happened in the past several years that certainly excites me as a neuropsychologist is that neuropsychologists and neuropsychological testing is often seen as a keystone in the concussion management piece that had not been present before. Previously, most of there are several different management guidelines, or 20 or 30 guideline and diagnoses out there that are used, or graded diagnoses. But previous to this, it was a time-dependent way to manage concussion. If you had a concussion, you would initially you could return to play within 15 minutes if you seemed clear. If it was a single concussion, you would sit out for a week. If it was a dual concussion or your second one, it would be a couple of weeks. It was all time dependent. Now we treat concussion in a very, very individualized way, and it has not only to do with the presentation of the concussion and the symptoms, which are all very different, even from concussion to concussion within the same athlete, but we also can now measure their cognitive functions and their higher cognitive functions, which actually come back later after symptom removal. So I think that the NFL is now initiating that. I know that the high schools are. I'm pretty proud of the fact that Pennsylvania has passed a law last year on concussion management, and I had a piece in that, and I feel good about that. So, you know, we're not there yet, but we're moving along, and I think that our practices are decent right now for what we know with the science of what we know.
Now, have you seen more, not only at the high school level, you said that Pennsylvania has kind of been at the forefront of this,
Right.
But at the professional level, have you heard or seen of more NFL teams turning to neuropsychologists to try and treat these players to figure out if it is in fact safe for them to play?
Absolutely. I believe that every NFL team now has neuropsychologists working with them. They all have measurement tools. Impact is one of the measurement tools that's used in most of the teams, although certainly not all. There's some other neurocognitive screening tools out there. And I'd like to say, you know, the neurocognitive evaluations are not the be-all to end-all. They are screening devices. When I do a neuropsychological evaluation on somebody more extensively, it could be anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. We really can't do that with everybody. And when you're trying to get baselines on a team, we need to have measurements that are sensitive to brain changes. And so through research, we found that there are certain areas and certain cognitive areas that tend to be more sensitive to brain changes, both in showing a concussion and discriminating when a concussion occurs, as well as when recovery of cognitive function occurs. And so I think that we're doing a better job with that now. Almost all of the schools in the Erie area, certainly the NFL teams, all of the NHL teams use this, most Division I and II colleges. I think you heard earlier from George Roberts, who really was in the forefront here in pushing Edinboro into, you know, getting some of the neurocognitive testing here. And so I think Edinboro has been really at one of the forefronts of that, which I'm pretty proud about since I'm a graduate of this place as well. So I think we're really moving forward with that.
Now, you said that the brain at an even younger age is more at risk of the symptoms of concussions. So in your mind, is it safe for younger children at maybe an elementary school level to compete and participate in these full-on contact sports?
I think so. There are various opinions about that. And again, as we get better at measuring this, there are certain aspects about the child and adolescent brain that we know tend to be more susceptible to some of the changes that happen with a concussion. So for example, at the NFL level or at the pro sport level, the adult level, you will see a trainer now taking somebody out and doing a a much more extensive evaluation than what used to be. It used to be if you knew the day, date, time, and place and what the play was, you could go back in. They now do a much more extensive evaluation with them. At the youth level, and I mean even at the high school level and even beginning within some of the early college level, when you suspect a concussion, you pull them and they're done for the day. We need them to then be evaluated. And because of that biological cascade that I talked to you about, the neurobiological cascade, we certainly want them to be evaluated there and shipped if they need to be shipped to the ER if they're showing certain symptoms. But then we want them to be evaluated at 24 hours. And at 48 hours to be able to see if there are changes that are happening because of that neurobiological cascade. So to answer the question about the younger children, on one hand, the younger child's brain moves a lot when you hit it. There's a little more room in there. On the other hand, body mass, speed is much lower. And so the contact that occurs and the speed in which it occurs is much less. And so they're not at risk. Also, children fall down a lot. Their brains are fairly resilient to the effects of mild injury. The problem gets to be with a younger child, if there is severe traumatic injury or moderate traumatic injury, then you can begin to change some of the developmental patterns within the brain. At this point, we talk about equipment, we talk about good coaching techniques, we talk about training techniques with these kids and teaching them the right techniques so that they are at less risk, making sure that helmets fit correctly, that they've got the correct size of things, and that they're being coached well. So I think that the children can safely participate in contact, and especially if they've got good people around them that know what they're doing.
Charles Rush was a standout at Erie Cathedral Prep High School before taking his talents to Penn State, where he started as an offensive lineman. Rush also served as an intern for a year at the Operations of Labor Department for the NFL. He gives an inside look at what concussion management was like at a high-caliber collegiate atmosphere.
Well, naturally playing, fortunately I was never diagnosed with a concussion, but being a lineman, anytime you see stars and learning more about concussions, I've come to realize I did have some concussions throughout my career, but fortunately I didn't have anything that permanently, at least that I know of, will not permanently prohibit me from doing or living my life or doing anything that I wanted to do. And also with the NFL, as kind of one of the things I saw during the frontline piece, when I was there wasn't that much discussion about concussions throughout the time because before I got there, they actually provided a pamphlet to the players about concussions and basically informed them about the proper protocols to go and see their team trainer and reach out to any services they might need if they did have any potential issues. But I don't think there was not nearly as much emphasis on any potential brain injuries or concussions at that time as there is now, which is I'm glad to see that awareness has been raised.
Now, when you were playing, did you have teammates that were diagnosed with concussions, I'm assuming?
I did. I had a few teammates. At Prep, I think we had a few, and also at Penn State, we had a few as well. And I was fortunate because Penn State had an excellent protocol, especially I remember for my senior year, we went through diagnostic testing prior to going into the season to establish a baseline for mental performance and mental acuity. So if someone did have a concussion, they had to go through that test before they're able to clear it and go back on the playing field again.
Do you think that test has become more in-depth now that the concussion problem has become more and more prevalent in sports?
I imagine that it has. I imagine that the software as well as some of the signs that doctors know to look for in a player that might have been concussed has definitely evolved since the time when I was at Penn State. And I think the more discoveries and the more information that there is out there about raising the awareness for potential brain injuries, the better off players will be and the better off the sport will be in the long term.
Now, more recently, we've seen a lot of former NFL players filing lawsuits against the NFL for not taking the proper precautions to deal with concussions.
Right.
Do you think they're entitled to these lawsuits and to file these lawsuits against the NFL?
I think that they are. I think that a lot of it has to deal with the fact that no, everyone that plays football knows there's an inherent risk with it. Anytime you have an ambulance on the sideline for potential injuries, you're inherently playing a dangerous sport. But I think a lot of the fact that comes out now that people are getting concussed and getting brain damage from just routine football plays definitely creates a level of possible liability for that brings the cause for the case. And you saw just a few last month the case did settle. And I definitely think that it's beneficial that some of the players that need some of the financial assistance to be able to cope with some of the damages that they've suffered from football are being attended to. But I think just the awareness they've brought to the issue is beneficial for not just the players in the NFL, but players of all football levels. So it's definitely a good sign.
So with these inherent risks, would you say that football is a safe sport for our youth to play?
I think it's definitely an area that needs to be discovered more. I think that you need to make sure you have a proper clearance, proper awareness, and know exactly what risks that a player is taking whenever they do step onto the field. I know growing up, you've seen players that have potentially been paralyzed from playing football, and you know that in the back of your head, but that's kind of the thing, the balancing act that any athlete has, that you have to be able to go out there with the confidence and ability that you can do anything that you desire on that field, but yet knowing in the back of your mind that there is a potential for severe injury. So I say, especially to anyone that's contemplating about playing football, make sure you have all the information that's available. And that's why I'm glad that more information and more awareness has been brought to potential brain injuries and concussions, because that more of that information is being delivered and being revealed to individuals. So as long as people have as full awareness of information as possible, the best decision, they'll be able to make the best decision for them as well as their children, if they have children potentially trying to decide they want to play football or not.
Would you let your children play football?
I would. I definitely would. And with that being said, I would definitely take the precautions and make sure that they have had a proper physical and make sure that they know everything that they're getting into, because with the career that I had, and not just on the football field, but the people I was able to be touched by, and it was a great experience. I would not be the man that I am today without having played the sport, without having the football coaches in my life. So to be able to say that I could look back and say I would change anything, honestly, I can't say that.
So how important is it for the sport that you love to fix these issues right now and make sure that they prove that football is a safe sport to play?
I think it's inherent and predicated on the sport's survival, to make sure that they're taking the best and proper steps to make sure that the players are properly protected and that they won't have any potential life-altering injuries moving forward, because you'll be hard-pressed to find any type of activity where parents understand and know that if a sport or any type of activity is inherently dangerous for their child, they'll let that child play that sport. So the better steps that NCAA, NFL can take to protect their players, I think the better off the sport will be for the long term.
After suffering several concussions early in his career, former Buffalo Bills safety Mark Kelso was told by doctors and trainers that the only way he could continue to play football was if he donned a Pro Cap helmet. The Pro Cap helmet features a soft outer shell that lessens the blow of a hit. Since then, Kelso has become an unofficial spokesman for concussion management.
Well, it impacts anybody's career, certainly at any level, whether it's a high school or collegiate or an NFL career. But you guys at the NFL level, obviously, there's a little bit of different issues going on there with the fact that they get paid to play the game and they get paid a lot of money, not quite as much that I got paid as they get paid today. But you have a family, and so you play a sport that you love, and you're earning a living doing that. But you understand that you want to leave the game healthy, and my number one goal was to leave the game healthy. I had a young family at the time when I suffered my first couple of concussions, so it was a decision of whether or not I was going to continue playing and risk potential long-term health effects, or whether I was going to say that I'm not going to play. And it kind of came down to that. I'm not going to play unless I have something that I know, a way that I can help mitigate the opportunity to get a concussion and find ways that it would be preventative, as opposed to just putting yourself out there and exposing yourself to additional injury.
Now, one of those ways you found was the Pro Cap helmet. Now, you were able to play for 4 or 5 more years after that, but not only play, but compete at a very high level. How did that impact your career?
Yeah, well, it saved my career, really, because I had a number of concussions, and I probably had one in '88 and several more in '89 prior to wearing that product. And that was a product that was developed at Erie, Pennsylvania. And our trainer at the time, Eddie Abramowski, is a training icon in the NFL. He had been with the Bills since their inception in 1960. And he had a relationship with some people in Erie because he attended high school in Erie. And they brought the product to his attention. And actually the person who engineered the product, Bert Strauss, brought it to his attention. And he basically said to me that I'm not going to let you play unless you wear this product because I believe this will work. I've seen the test data, and it will help mitigate those forces that are causing concussions. And those guys, the medical staff, and there's a lot of rhetoric now about the NFL and what the NFL knew and what they didn't know and how much they disclosed to players and how much they didn't disclose to players. And quite frankly, I don't share that similar experience with other players. I can't speak for other teams. I can only speak for my relationship with the Bills medical staff, the training staff, and the medical professionals, and they never treated me anything differently than their own kids. And they knew that they were interested in my long-term health and wanted to make sure that I left the game healthy, and they treated it as such. So they said, you don't wear the product, you're not going to play, and subsequently I wore it for 5 years, the last 5 years of my career, and so it saved my career because I would have stopped playing had I not had that opportunity.
Now, can you kind of compare what the process was like if you had a concussion in the road back when you played as compared to what it has turned into now?
Well, about the only difference when I was playing and the protocol that exists now, quite frankly, I'm not sure. Sometimes the protocol is even a little loose now. But when I played, they would not clear me to play the next week. I mean, if I had a concussion on Sunday, I was not going to be able to play the next week. And I think the Bills were at the forefront of that re-entry to play protocol because they knew that if you had any symptoms, that you were susceptible to a second hit syndrome or something that could be more catastrophic, so they wouldn't allow you to play that next week. And there was the rules today require evaluation by an independent neurological evaluation so that you can re-enter play because they feel like there's some conflict of interest with medical professionals and guys that are associated or girls or whatever the physician might be that are associated with the NFL club. So there's a little bit different protocol now, but I would say that the protocol that I was engaged in order to re-enter the playing field was something that was as strict as what's going on today.
Now, you were experiencing people that were at the forefront, like the Buffalo Bills training staff while you were there. Has that kind of shaped your ambition to educate and to promote player safety in football now as far as concussions are regarded?
It's part of it. It's part of it. First of all, we have a responsibility as ex-NFL players. The league, which makes a lot of money on young players and the excitement that the game of football generates, has a responsibility. I think that manufacturing companies, these companies that make a lot of money, Under Armour and Nike and all these companies that make an awful lot of money selling sports equipment that helps improve performance of young players, has a responsibility to help find a solution to mitigate this problem. And certainly I have a passion for it because youth sports was extremely important to me. It's important to my family, my own boys. I have boys that play in college now, and I have a daughter who competed in figure skating, so not as much of a team sport, but youth sports build so many great character traits in young people, and we need to have youth sports, particularly football, which is what my passion was, is because of the teamwork and all of the character traits, the commitment, the persistence, the toughness, the respect that it gives you for one another, and you're in a competitive situation. There's so many character traits that you can develop by participating in youth sports that we have to find a way to make sure that young people realize the advantages of all those things without the potential long-term effects of a head injury.
Now, you said you have 2 boys that play football now. Does it scare you at all that they're playing with the risk of concussion?
Yeah, no question. I don't have 2 that are playing football. One's a baseball guy
Okay.
and one's a football guy. But they play, and they've had some concussions. There's no question. And they both had them at high school. And I don't know if you played in high school. If you did, you probably had an issue where you might have experienced a concussion. I mean, not too many people play the game of football and don't experience it at least one time. But certainly, to me, it's almost a tragedy that I had the benefit of technology 20 years ago that still hasn't gained acceptance on a national level. That I think can help some mitigate the forces that cause concussions. So it's frustrating to me, very frustrating to me, and I think that there's been some significant improvement in helmet technology, but not to the point that I would have liked to have seen it at this stage of the game.
So are you still a proponent for the Pro Cap, and do you think that teams should start to integrate that?
Well, the soft shell technology, which is what I call it, it's exterior energy management technology, I think is the best way, all the test data that I've ever seen and participated in tests, that's the best way to mitigate forces that have the potential to cause concussion. So if you have a helmet that's got an exterior that has some give to it, then I think that's the best way to mitigate those forces. And helmet companies, in some respects, would disagree, because one reason is because they don't have patents on the other things, which the company that I'm working with does, and the other reason is there were a lot of issues with neck injury, and you can't have anything that sticks, because if you do, it could have the potential to cause a neck injury. So you need something that has a very low coefficient of friction, which actually the soft outer, the energy management outer shell actually has a lower coefficient of friction than a polycarbonate helmet, which is what most helmets are made out of. So this material is if you want to get technical, we're talking, but it's more, this material is injection molded polyurethane, whereas a hard shell helmet, which is what everybody wears now, is a polyurethane. And helmets weren't designed to prevent concussions. I mean, they mitigate some of those forces, but they were designed originally to prevent skull fractures. They do that very well, but there's a lot of things that have to happen to improve their performance so that they can mitigate those forces that cause concussion.
Now, on the other side from equipment, are you a fan of some of the new rules that the NFL has implemented to try and steer players away from leading with the head?
Anything that makes it safer for the players is a good thing in my book. Players can change, defensive backs can change. There's a lot of things that have been going on in the NFL this year that there's players that I think have done a really good job of trying to keep their head out of it and trying not to involve the head of the opposing player. And there's some other guys I think that have done it the opposite way and have still continued to target the head and done some things. One of them just got suspended this week. He should have been suspended more if it would have been up to me, because he's been a repeat offender and a guy who continues to try to strike the opponent's head, which is not the right thing to do. I mean, they've made rules in the kickoff. They've adjusted the kickoff, moved the kickoff up so that there's obviously a lot less kickoff returns, because those high-speed collisions have the potential to cause injury or cause concussive injuries. They've taken out the wedge play. They won't let guys ear hole another player when it's a blindside hit or a defenseless player. And sometimes a defensive back is a victim because you just can't avoid hitting somebody in the head. But there are times, and I would say 90% of the time, that you have the opportunity to adjust the way you hit somebody, to use your shoulder and make sure you don't strike the opposing player's head. So any rule adjustment or change that makes it safer for the person who's being hit or the person who's doing the hitting, in my mind, is a good thing.
Now we go to the full panel discussion, moderated by Lilly Broadcasting's Mike Ruzzi, and also including a question and answer session with the audience.
We're going to start with the panelists. I'm going to start with Mark and work my way to my right and just get your opinion on what you saw tonight so far.
Well, it's tough to be the first one to talk, I guess, about this. I think it's compelling, the journalism that is done here. And I think that those of us who are scientists notice, and you can see where research is never devoid of politics. And that's something that we have to, as students, that you have to be very, very aware of. I think that there's an incredible tension there. And I think that the tension exists even now. As somebody, I deal with concussed athletes every day, and I have to make decisions about return to play. And that tension remains even today. I think that one of the things that occurred here is that the research that was being done was being driven by a very in-house kind of mentality. And always when there is an external threat to that, we even know from systems theory for all of the psychologists out there, that when there's a threat to that internal system, that there's resistance to that system. But that is really what good scientists do, is they begin to incorporate those external threats. And I think that that's what we're seeing here. And the thing that's most exciting to me about this kind of journalism that is being done, and something that I've been trying to incorporate in my practice, is to try to change a culture. And culture change is not easy, and it's certainly not easy in sport. I believe that even when you look at the history of sport, which a couple of years ago when George had put together a panel, I was able to speak about the history of sport even here at Edinboro. And I think when you look at the history of sport, that it is incredibly incorporated into our culture. And we certainly see that with the NFL and with football in general. And so I think that what we're looking at now is a culture change. And we're hoping that science and good science is going to drive that.
George?
There's a couple things. Growing up in the 70s, I learned from the Watergate hearings that it's not the crime, it's the cover-up that's the problem. And I think that was a thing that impressed me a great deal about this, and I've not seen it until tonight. But I do know in the second half of this program, there are a lot of familiar faces that I personally know. Gary Hanna, who's here tonight, and I started in the mid-90s to get really, really involved in this whole idea of concussed athletes, and it's a relatively new science. Just in the last 15 to 20 years, there have been so many things that have happened, and the folks like Julian Bales and Ann McKee, who's in the second half of this, Kevin Guskowitz, people that were here on our campus with us, have brought the research now that's come and the science behind all of this. And I think that's the strength in where we're going. Even in the last 2 years, we've seen significant educational efforts that have led our athletes to be more honest with us and more forthcoming, and it's helped us to manage their injuries.
Charles, after playing for so long and watching that tonight, your reaction?
Well, it's definitely an outstanding production and just presenting the issue that's out there, and it's definitely profound. One of the things that you can see by the production is that so many people have been impacted by playing professional football, and the levels that what that impact and that activity might have on you. And one of the things that Steve Young alluded to in the video was that you can see a knee injury, you can see an ankle injury, but you can't see a brain injury. And one of the things as being a former player, the biggest thing you don't want to ever have questioned is your toughness. So you always try to fight between doing what's best for you, what's best for the team, versus are you doing any permanent injury to yourself potentially moving forward. And I think some of the research that's been conducted and done, raising the issue of some of the potential injuries that could happen with football, is definitely making the sport better and safer. And the more research that's done, the better off it will be. One of the questions I had earlier today was about what were some of the things that I saw when I was working for the NFL. Well, when I started the NFL in 2007, and at that time they had just renewed their CBA with the NFL Players Association, the collective bargaining agreement. And during that agreement, they had the total revenues for the league was allocated to the players was 59.5% of the total revenue. So out of about $9 billion at a time, the players were receiving almost 60% of that. And as for later on, the NFL owners didn't like that. That's why you had a lockout in 2011. And you see kind of some of the lengths that the league went to try to dismiss and try to downplay some of the research that was produced beforehand was because of some of the money that's implicated with the issue. So it's definitely interesting to see from the business perspective as well as from the player's perspective.
Mark, how about for you? Your reaction after watching that?
Well, I'll keep my comments brief on this because the question and answer, I think, is where we want to go. But the first thing is when there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of conflicts of interest. There's no question about that. And the only other thing I'll say about this, I could comment, I could sit and talk for hours on this this piece. I hadn't seen the piece either, but I'll say this. There were 3,200 players or so that were members of the concussion lawsuit. I was not one of them. I don't feel like I have problems. I'm not saying that problems don't exist and that concussions could not cause long-term problems. I hope they don't. I was tested. I was very reluctant to get tested for years, and then I went and got tested by a psychoneurologist who said two things. Number one is you have a memory in the 99th percentile, and your intelligent quotient is commensurate with your SAT scores. So one good thing and one not so good thing. But I don't feel like I have problems, and here's the reason. Now, I did suffer a lot of concussions, and I wore an extra pad on my head, and I have a lot of controversy, and there's a lot of issues that I have because there's two things that come out of this. Number one is I never felt that my medical staff, training staff, or medical professionals with the Bills, some of which are still with the Bills today, understated the seriousness of concussions to me. Okay? I sat in a neurologist's office after one of my concussions, and I said, Doc, I have to play this week. And he said, if you play this week and sustain another concussion, you will die on the field. To me, that communicates seriousness. So my medical staff in Buffalo, I can't speak for any other team in the league besides the medical staff, my medical staff. But that, I never felt that they understated that seriousness. And that's an important issue. The second issue is we all have a responsibility because I have three college-age kids that have been significant participants in youth sports. And we all have a responsibility to do something to help mitigate this problem because youth sports development develops character traits that you can't develop in other places. And we need to make sure that we allow our young people to play the games where they can develop those traits and play them safely without the threat of long-term medical complications.
Now, we are going to get to your questions quickly, but I got to ask Mark one thing because you got to know his background. When he played for the Bills from '86 to '93, he wore a pro cap on his helmet, which was helped to reduce the risk of concussions. Mark, just briefly give the background on pro cap and your history there with that.
Here, open that bag and take the red cap out.
And here is a picture of Mark wearing it in Buffalo.
And put the black one down. That's a separate unit. Put that one down and just hold the red. The red one is. I didn't wear a helmet any different. I didn't wear a different helmet than anybody else. And I wore a standard NFL or standard helmet. I wore a Rydell helmet, but I wore a pad on top of the helmet. This one looks a lot better than the one I wore. Okay. What's the worst time in school? I work at a high school now. I'm an executive director at a high school. What's the worst school years? Anybody? Middle school. Isn't middle school the worst? Middle school. Okay. I put a cap on. That cap you just showed looked pretty nice. I put a cap on in practice with my NFL teammates, Jim Kelly and the like, and I walked out in the field. I felt like an 8th grade schoolboy because they couldn't contain themselves. They were laughing so hard it looked so ridiculous. But my medical staff said, if you don't wear it, you can't play. I had a young daughter at the time, and I wasn't willing to risk my long-term health. And I felt that I played with this for 5 years. There were 2 other players that played significant time in the NFL, offensive linemen who played with this. Now this unit was actually laser designed to fit a Revolution Speed, a current Revolution Speed helmet. But all the testing, and I'll leave with this because I don't want to start monopolizing the conversation. But here's what the conflict was with this League of Denial: is that the NFL, yes, withheld evidence. Dr. Elliot Pellman was the director of the concussion clinic or concussion MTBI committee, and some people took issue with that because he was a rheumatologist. I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I don't take issue with that because he was still a medical professional who could at least validate that the science was being conducted in a proper way, which apparently he may not have. But he was a medical professional.
Okay, so all the testing, not all of it, but significant testing on this helmet and the product that I wore to help prevent concussions was done at the Penn State Biomechanical Lab. And there's an article, you can Google it if you want, Bloomberg.net, an article that came out this spring, and I know that that was part of this, the whole issue and the litigation that was going on. Dr. Elliot Pellman, after they did testing on my helmet with this cap on it, he wrote a memo to Commissioner Tagliabue, and he said, and I quote, well, maybe I don't quote, but I'm pretty close, that the Penn State testing has confirmed our deepest fears as regards head injury and potential catastrophic neck injury regarding the Pro Cap. He cited the product. And the sentence underneath in the article is Dr. David Nelson, who was the PhD biomechanical engineer who ran the lab, said, "It's amazing to me that Dr. Pellman can reach that conclusion when the scientific evidence tells me the exact opposite." So there's a lot of other things that are going on here and how helmet companies have potentially prevented new technologies from being introduced that might in fact help mitigate the problem. And I'll say one last thing. See, I keep saying that, but anybody who knows me knows that I'm a broadcaster now too, so I might not stop talking. But let me just say this too. Well, I can't compare you to me because you're much thicker than I am. So, but somebody my size or somebody Charles' size, you're two guys the exact same size, the exact same weight, almost the exact same hit. And one player might suffer a concussion, one player might not. There's so many variables that are involved. And then when you start talking about elite athletes that play in the NFL, myself was notwithstanding, you know, but these guys are athletic freaks sometimes. So, and you can't even compare them to the general population, which I would think you would concur with that. So that, enough said for now.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask one question each to Charles and George and Dr. Mark, and then we're going to open it up to you guys. And Charles, we were talking about this earlier, the internal struggles that the athletes have with moving forward. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think a lot of it has to deal with the fact that at such a young age, you're trained to basically play through any type of injury. And even as the higher you go in football, if you do have a significant injury, you'll do whatever you can to try to get back onto the field. They always stress, and all coaches always say that there's a difference between being hurt and being injured. And sometimes, depending on the situation, depending on the consequences of that game, that line gets very blurry and that line disappears from one point. I remember one time in high school, I got injured as a Western Finals, state championship, Western Finals for high school, and I thought I broke my ankle. Had no idea if it was broke or if it wasn't. I took 6 Advil, taped it up, went back in the game. Didn't think twice about it. And after that, it wound up not being broken, but I did have to rehab for about 2 months afterwards. And it's tough because, as I mentioned before, having head injuries, no one really knows exactly what type of injury is and what type of damage is, and most importantly, you don't know what the consequences after that of what might happen. And even just the psychology of playing at a high level when you're playing football, I know myself personally, I had to believe that I was the best person to ever put on cleats before I stepped on that field, because I'm going against people that might be 40, sometimes 50 pounds heavier than me, and having to try to do my job at the best possible standard, especially playing at Penn State, playing at one of the top colleges in the nation. So having that ability and having that mental toughness, but yet still trying to balance in your mind that you're one play away from being permanently injured. And looking back now, I kind of still amazed by the fact that I was able to go out there and play at the level I did, because logically, a person wouldn't have put themselves through the trauma to the body, and also now learning more through the mind that you would with football. But with that being said, there's nothing I would change about my career. As Mr. Kelso mentioned, that the lessons that you learn from playing youth sports, especially playing football, it teaches you toughness, it teaches you mental acuity, and teaches you how to persevere through when things might not be at their best. And I've met outstanding people through that time. So I would not be the same person I am today. Probably would not be in front of you. So I definitely think that going through the process, as well as the more information you have about playing the sport, the more and better off you are moving forward. So it's definitely a balancing act, but it's something that you're always beneficial off knowing more information for. So it's good.
Thank you, Charles. Now, I asked George before we get started, what's the number one question I should ask you? He posed this one to me. Should we discontinue football? Should we?
The short answer is no, and the long answer is no. Football is probably, the greatest American game. I'm sure the baseball people would disagree with that, but it's a game that, as has been previously mentioned, it teaches us a lot about life. It's a shame that girls don't get to play football too. I've always felt that, not against the boys, but it's just it's a sport that everybody should be able to benefit from. One of the things that we have found out in the research is that the numbers of injuries are great because the number of players are great. When it comes to concussions, it's the only pathology or disease that I know of that probably has 100% of the people have been affected by it personally. There's probably nobody in this room that's not had a concussive episode in their life. In some way. At some point in your life, you clunked your head, you did something where you saw stars or something like that, and it's going to happen no matter what you do. It happens to skateboarders, it happens to Girl Scouts, it happens to kids in every group, the 4-H'ers, whoever. I think it happens to everybody, and I don't think you can finger point at football. When done properly, with the right coaching, the right teaching, the right precautions and prevention, I think it's a very, very safe sport. We also should consider the fact that there are other sports where other athletes are at higher risk than they are in football, statistically. Girls soccer and girls basketball, and now what we're finding out, well, lacrosse,
Women's
but
lacrosse.
interestingly enough, cheerleading has a high incidence of concussive episodes now with competitive cheerleading. And we don't even talk about whether we should, or debate the fact that we should stop those activities. So I don't think we should stop football, no. I think football is an integral part of our society and our life, and it can be done very safely.
Okay, last question goes to Dr. Mark before we open it up to the audience. You've been involved with the Otters, the local hockey team, for 9 years. You also saw what happened to Sidney Crosby of the Penguins when he went through his concussions. Where's hockey right now as far as concussions and prevention and things of that nature?
Well, first off, I'd like to say that hockey is actually the greatest sport, even though, since I was a hockey player in Erie. And I think that if in my doctoral program, one of the things when you're doing your dissertation, you answer your own question. So I think I'll rephrase the question.
Okay.
And what I think that the NHL is doing, and I do believe that they are years ahead of the NFL. And I think that the issue that was seen up here when they talked about the pamphlet that was handed out to the players and then somewhat mocked that. But the word in there the words were, if managed properly. Now with Mr. Kelso, I agree, and we need more and better research with equipment. People have actually talked about the equipment as causing injury. What I always say in my concussion management talks is until we figure out how to make our brain like a woodpecker brain, we're still going to get concussions, even with the best equipment, because your brain still moves around in the skull. The thing that Mr. Kelso said, which is accurate, it mitigates injury. And some of the work that Kevin Gishkevitz has done down at UNC, and he was at this campus, and he's doing it with football and with hockey, and I'll get to the Sydney thing in a second, is they're putting accelerometers into the helmets. And we know that that sometimes somebody can take a 70G hit, 70G, and not have a concussion. and somebody else can get a 2G hit and get one. We don't know why. It has to do with vectors. It has to do with a lot of other kinds of things, and we're still trying to understand the sport of collision. Hockey is a collision sport, and less so than football. And what happened with Sidney Crosby, I think, really put concussion and concussion management on the map. Sidney is an elite athlete. He is a Ferrari, and he was relegated to being a 4-cylinder Yugo. And when you look at his interviews, he had what we call a vestibular concussion. And now we're beginning to subtype concussions. And we know that those who have vestibular concussions have a much more prolonged rate of recovery. He had a very vestibular concussion, so he had a lot of diplopia and a lot of vision problems, a lot of dizziness, nauseousness. Movement issues were a problem for him. And so the NHL, along with now the NFL, are managing these things much better. And we believe, and in fact in the second half of this, it doesn't get talked about much, but Ann McKee, who is here, really does say, when I spent about 3 hours with her at dinner, along with George and some other people and with Kevin, is we really do believe that if we manage these things well, that the brain will heal. Much like if another body part that I have gets injured, and if I bruise my shoulder, if you come and punch it the next day, it bruises worse. You punch it the day after that, it bruises worse. And pretty soon, if you can repeatedly hit it in close approximation, I'm going to have tissue damage. This is what the NHL really understands now. If you hit me and I have an injury to my shoulder and I let it heal, and a month later, and we're not going to go with time dependence, and I want to mention that in a second, you hit me again after I'm totally healed, I don't bruise worse. We believe that the brain tissue in many ways, although not in all ways, and I could defer to Dr. Mainzer here, our expert neurosurgeon here, but in many ways does heal. We used to say it didn't, but it does. And so what we really believe is that management is the key. And I've got to say we really believe. And it's a little bit of faith. And this is what was happening with the NFL, is they were acting on faith. They really believed that these folks were okay, because when they would test them, they were okay. But then science moves forward with your ability to measure. And so as we could measure the cognitive processes, and as imaging got better, as Dr. Koken could talk about, as a lot of things get better, and we are able to look at the images that the tau proteins, and looking at some of the slides from those who had died, we begin to understand brain pathology better. So I think the short of that is NHL is doing a really, really good job at this. The NFL is doing a much better job at this. And my issue and my belief is if we manage this well, that we're going to have a turnaround in the long-term effects and hopefully a reduction in the CTE that we are seeing now.
Thank you, Mark. All right, questions. Who has a question? Go ahead, young man.
A lot of leagues now, NCAA is starting to eject players for targeting, NFL starting to fine people for hits to the head, NHL starting to fine people for hits to the head. Are they doing enough with these rule changes, or do you think they need to do more?
Charles, you want to take that one? Are they doing enough?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You can.
Okay, well, basically, we're just asking that due to some of the actions on the field, is the NFL doing enough to try to relegate some of the previous behavior that caused some of these brain injuries? And I think that they're definitely taking proper steps to try to change the culture, because I know the first steps the NFL took, well, let's say it was back in like 2010. I remember after a game where the Steelers were playing the Browns, when James Harrison was fined for concussing two of the Browns, and they really started impacting, coming down on players for having head-to-head collisions. And I think it's definitely starting a process. And I know, bigger point, Brandon Merriweather was fined and banned for 2 games as of some of his actions on the field on Sunday. I think justly properly hitting players where their money is, where they're fined. That's definitely the biggest way to get players' attention and try to change some of the behaviors. And I know he's a repeat offender. He's been fined numerous times, but when you start impacting games, and games could possibly turn into half seasons, possibly turn into seasons, and it gets to the point where it would be a liability for the team. So putting someone else as an example, I definitely think that will deter the behavior moving forward, and I definitely think it's a proper step.
Go ahead.
There has been some changes in the game itself, and they're subtle changes, but one of the things you'll notice on Saturday afternoons or Sunday afternoons is there are far fewer runbacks of kickoffs. The kickoff was one of the areas, and Mark can attest to this because he was a special teams player. The kickoff was one of those areas where there were a lot of concussions occurring, and you'll see now that there are far fewer kickoffs run back. They're kicked out of the end zone. There are more 106 and 107-yard touchdowns being run back now because people want that part of the game and to be exciting. But if you look at the statistics, the amount of kickoff returns now are about half of what they were over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. But the amount of concussions occurring on kickoffs has been reduced by about 2/3 because of that simple rule change.
And also, I would say that the NHL is making incredible strides, and in fact, the concussion incidence has dropped dramatically. The highest rate of concussion is incidental collision, and oftentimes with their own members. And you're no longer allowed to hit anybody from behind, and if you see their numbers, you're going to get a penalty and you're going to get fined. The other thing I would say is that there's a tremendous movement in youth sport. Minnesota has made incredible gains in youth sport and beginning to penalize teams for major penalties, hockey teams, for hitting from behind. They're getting points taken away. And now you're beginning to change the culture on the bench, where the teammates are now getting on some of the bad actors. And now we're starting to see a change in that behavior.
Okay, we're going to go about another 10 or 15 minutes, so we'll try to get as many questions in as possible. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask these two gentlemen, do you think football should be abolished? Please.
Mark, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I don't mean to stand up, but
No
I think
problem.
that people over here can't see. So she wants to know if football should be abolished. It will be if we don't fix this problem, because moms will say, I'm not wanting my kids to play. And if we think for a minute that the NFL isn't concerned about that, somebody said, do you think they're just protecting their market share? Heck yeah, that's what they're doing. They want to make money. When money's involved, there's a lot of, like we said, conflict of interest. Do I want to see it abolished? I have a son who plays college football right now who's actually is done for the season because he has a herniated disc. So I love the game. I think you can teach things with the game of football for young men, to teach young men to be men of empathy, teach them to be leaders, teach them to be responsible, that you cannot teach in other team sports. But I want the game to be played safely. And there's a lot of variables here. We're talking about concussion management, we're talking about recognizing concussion, we're talking about strength and conditioning, we're talking about skill development and proper skill development, we're talking about equipment improvement. So there's so many variables that go into it. They're practice regimens, because more concussions occur in practice than they do on the game field. Because you orchestrate drills to create contact. So no, do I think it should be abolished? No, but we have to find a way to mitigate the problem. If you go back, how many years was it? A Time magazine did an article in the 1920s that had a picture of a skull on the magazine that said, the death of the NFL or the death of football.
The NCAA was started in 1905 by Roosevelt because of football.
Right.
Right.
To echo Mr. Kelso's comments, I don't think it should be abolished. I think as long as it's properly managed and the proper protocols are in there for player safety, that it possibly can be able to continue into flourishing within the future, as long as people know exactly what the inherent risks are. I know one of the things, talking about some of the older players and some of the things that they deal with when they leave the game, I can think of Jerome Bettis, I can think of Earl Campbell, about Hall of Fame NFL running backs that take almost an hour to get out of bed. And as Jim Otto echoed on the film, like, people and football players know that. They know they accept that risk when they put the helmets and shoulder pads on from high school all the way up to the NFL, that they could possibly walk away with some type of debilitating injury that would bother them for the rest of their life. But the biggest contention comes about from the head injuries, because players were not cognizant of what the damages that might occur from not just sort of big hits that you see during games, but just some of the repetitive, routine practice behaviors that every football player goes through. But as long as that's properly managed, and it's glad to see that some of the protocols that are being adopted and being taken place on colleges and with NFL teams, I think the game should be able to continue.
You see what happened to Mike Webster.
Right.
That was not very pretty.
Not at all. And it's tragic to see, especially growing up a Steelers fan. Right.
And it was a very different time, and people, they did not report, and George knows this. We have to deal with under-reporting, and it was a very different time, and they were not managed well at all.
There are lifestyles of NFL players. Both of those players used significant performance-enhancing drugs, which was not illegal at the time.
That's right.
Which I think, and I'm sure many physicians would contend that could have exacerbated the problem at the same time. So I do love the game, but if we can't make it safe, but remember that there's a big difference between NFL guys and then our youth players who can play. Because I would contend that like somebody said, everybody in here has had a concussion at some point in their life.
And Charles Rush.
Yes.
If player one gets player two, and player one causes a concussion for player two, should player one be abolished from football for life?
I'd have to say no, because I think there's so many different variables that play into what player one did. If player one did a proper technique in a hit.
Do you see what happened in New Orleans when they speared? They abolished the coach for a whole year.
Right.
Did you see what happened there?
Well, that was definitely improper action. So that's why those punishment had to take place. And I'm glad that it did, because they're trying. That's one of the things that the NFL, as well as all other organized football, is trying to eliminate that type of behavior and that type of culture. As long as it's a proper technique and everything's done by the rules, because football is a collision sport, injuries and potentially brain injuries are going to occur. That's something that going into it. But as long as those proper technique is trained and everyone knows exactly what's going on, it should be, I believe, should be able to continue. It does not, as long as you have the proper awareness.
We have another question?
Yes.
I guess my question is a two-part. Do you feel comfortable with the equipment, and specifically the helmet that is produced today to stop concussions? And if so, does that make you harder or play more aggressive because of that?
Well,
Should they be concussion proof? Can you make the helmet concussion proof?
No.
They have not at this time. They have not, because especially with as Dr. Hogue alluded to, the movement of the brain. Unless you can stop the movement of the brain whenever you have this type of collisions, there's no such thing as a concussion-proof helmet. Hopefully they can create a concussion-proof helmet, because I think every person that participates in football will be better off for that. But to allude to your question, I definitely have seen the technology improve regarding the helmets. Again, especially during my time at Penn State, we played with traditional ride-out helmets, and up to my senior year, we actually switched the helmets. It was mandatory for everyone on the team to switch from the ride-out helmets to the I believe, DNA helmets. And we did see a reduction in concussions. And I can't necessarily say it enables a player to go out and play harder, because every single time you're on that field, you're playing to the maximum of your capacity and your maximum of your ability. It really doesn't factor in saying that, oh, well, I'm not going to be injured, I'm going to go as hard as I can. You're naturally doing that. Because, if you don't do that, either A, your team will lose, or B, your spot will be taken by the person that's coming up behind you and had just kind of the same pedigree and has the same desire to be in the same place that you are. That's why they came to that school. So you have to compete for your position.
Okay, last question. Go ahead.
Okay, so Charles, to your point where you're playing 110% and you're worried about somebody taking your spot.
Yes.
I read an article today, they interviewed 2 high school kids who won't admit to a concussion. Now, I know there's baselines and you can determine if they've gotten hit and you can tell it's obvious, but how about for the kids that aren't obvious, don't want to talk about it, want to go back out because they don't want to lose their spot,
Right.
and then you risk second impact syndrome?
I think that definitely plays in the protocols that are implemented. I think it's more observation by having proper trainers and proper coaches and proper doctors monitoring that player, monitoring that player's behavior and actions. we were talking earlier and talking about how the NFL now has independent physicians monitoring players' actions during a play and after the play to see if they have any type of movements, because that might lead to possibly having a concussion. Because honestly, players need to be protected from themselves.
Well, and I'm talking at the high school level.
Even in the high school level.
Some of them don't even have athletic training.
Right.
You know, so.
That's something that coaches, and I believe coaches have been trained properly to be able to identify concussions. So it needs to have a watchful eye to make sure that if someone does exhibit those type of behaviors, they'll be removed from the field and be able to protect it for themselves.
George?
I'm going to stand up, even though you might not notice it like Mark said. I had a really interesting discussion with the chairman of the PIAA Sports Medicine Committee on Monday. And his comment to me was, we're seeing so many more concussions, and I think the reason we are is because we have the athletes are reporting because of the educational things that we've done over the last 2 years. A lot of times with kids like that you're describing, what's reported to the athletic trainers and the coaches may not be reported by that person. But as Charles said earlier, you know, when somebody gets in the huddle and they have no idea what they're doing, his teammates will tell on him now.
Yeah.
And so I think we're seeing that more and more, and that's a real positive thing that's come out in the last few years. Players are a lot less reluctant to stay in the game. They don't want to hide their symptoms because they know that coming down the road something bad's going to happen. The other thing is this second impact syndrome that you said. Because you mentioned it, I didn't. Nobody wanted to bring it up, but second impact syndrome is a horrible thing that people die from. And fortunately, it's almost 100% of the time that they die from it. So when you hear second impact, it doesn't mean they get 2 concussions in a row. It means they get 2 concussions very close together, and then their brain swells up and they die. And it very, very seldom happens to anybody. It usually happens to boys under 21 years old. And it's a horrible thing. So I think we're looking more and more at the CTE issue than we are looking at second impact. Because second impact was something we talked about a lot, but it just doesn't happen very, very often. So, yes.
Yeah, and the one thing that I would say, I'm going to tell a really quick story because we did have a second impact syndrome that happened about 8 years ago just south of here. And that's been partly my mantra. This is why we do what we do at North Shore and why we're pushing education. Really quick story about throwing baselines. I had an athletic trainer who, to me, are the most important people in this entire discussion because they're taping, they're seeing these kids. I had an athletic trainer from the Pencrest area call me one day in August and said, Dr. Hogue, I think I have a problem here because I just baselined the entire team and they looked really bad, and I thought there was something wrong with our computer system. And I went in and I took the impact test myself, and it was fine. And I pulled one of my kids aside and I said, "What's going on?" And he admitted after she put the screws to him that they all decided as a team to throw their baselines. And she didn't know what to do, so that when they got a concussion, you wouldn't know. Well, number one, that's pretty flawed anyway, because there are a whole lot of other symptoms we're going to look at. But pretty much without skipping a beat, I said, well, when do you meet with the team next? And she said, well, tonight. And I said, well, I want you to clear this with a coach, but I'd like you to say that you talked to your consulting neuropsychologist, and he just declared the entire team is brain injured, and none of you can play, and you have to turn in your equipment. And a miracle happened. They all got better. And so this culture change that George is talking about, because we're talking about this and because parents are involved now in a very positive way, kids they lie. Athletes lie. I lied as a hockey player to play, as Charles was saying. You don't want to miss that spot. But it's a different culture now, and we're trying to change that, and kids are reporting on one another, which is a good thing.
Prior to the panel discussion, the audience saw the first half of the PBS Frontline documentary, League of Denial, the NFL's Concussion Crisis. To view the full film, visit video.pbs.org. Thanks for watching.